definitely one of my favorite sections to plan in the show. And this next session will not disappoint. Johnson & Johnson, I've had the privilege of working with them for, 4 or 5 years now, and they bring it. So I'm excited to welcome to the stage Ina Fried, Chief Technology Correspondent for Axios, and Mark Leibowitz, Global Head of Health Technology from Johnson & Johnson, for a hopefully inspiring discussion. Thanks. Why don't you go? Thanks.
Well, thanks so much. I cover all areas of tech from, big tech and all these different areas, but one of the ones that interests me the most is health and tech, because these are areas that have traditionally operated pretty independently of one another. The tech industry has moved at one pace, the health industry has moved at another. Technology has had a different meaning within the healthcare industry, and health has had a different meaning in the tech. When tech people talk about healthcare, they're often talking about wellness, tracking steps, doing some things that are nice but allow them to steer clear of regulation. And when health people talk about tech, they're talking about monitoring and automation, but not the kind of consumer tech. But increasingly, that's the old way of looking at things and less true. Apologies. You've been navigating this. How have you seen these worlds move closer together, and what are the areas where health industry and tech industry still don't get one another?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fair characterization. So a little context, I've been with J&J for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years in various technology companies. I was lucky enough to be part of the early team at Google, at Dropbox. I started a company that was not very successful, but learned a lot, and found myself at J&J leading this new initiative to help sort of digitally transform the organization. And so I've been living and breathing a lot of the dynamics that you just described. I think part of it just starts with methodology. So you're right that I think tech means different things, whether you're coming from a technology company or coming from a healthcare company. But I do think that there's a common, or should be, a common vocabulary around how you think about problems. So how you frame them up, and then how you operationalize them. And that's a big part of what we've been trying to do at J&J. I think that's a big part of where things tend to break down when the healthcare sector engages with the technology sector.
How much is that still, that culture clash though, still a challenge? And obviously you see it now within J&J. What I see is, tech companies, whether it's your former employer, Google or others, sort of still bringing that tech mentality of, oh, let's just push it out, let's get some data, see what happens, and we'll fix it, which obviously doesn't translate super well to healthcare. Similarly, I think the healthcare field, there's still that incremental innovation mentality, the how can we take what we're doing today and digitize it a bit, improve it at the edges, versus what would this look like if we start on a clean sheet of paper? Where is that starting to break down and improve, and where is that still present?
Yeah, well, I think things have definitely improved even over just the last, call it 2 to 3 years. So I think that a number of the technology companies that you mentioned are starting to recruit people from the healthcare space and giving them the autonomy and degrees of freedom to actually do things the way that are more likely to actually produce real results. And similarly, and Johnson & Johnson being a great example, there are an increasing number of healthcare companies that are hiring people like myself and giving us the ability to come in and rethink the way that we go about things. With all that said, there is still very much a difference in terms of cadence, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of how we work. And I think it's just going to be an iterative exercise. And I think it's going to take a number of different attempts to get things right.
You've been there a couple of years now. What would you point to if you had to point to, like, this is a good example of where I want to take the company? This is a good example of us sort of bringing a new approach to something. What would you point to if someone said, where have you had the greatest impact? What's one example of sort of a digital mindset really working within J&J?
Yeah, that's a good question. So earlier this week, J&J announced something called the Mask ID, which is a 3D printed vehicle to deliver various sorts of topical applications for skincare. I think that builds on the work that J&J announced last year, Skin 360, which is a analytical tool that assesses skincare. Is it going to change the world? Maybe not, but I think it's a great example of how we went to market last year not necessarily knowing exactly how users were going to respond to it or even how it was going to work. And then we got some data back and we built a follow-on solution to that. And I think I'm proud of J&J for saying it's not just ship it and forget about it. It's let's release something, get some real world data, and then listen to what users are telling us in terms of what's missing, what could be improved, and let's improve on that.
How much of an advantage or helpfulness is it that J&J has both the healthcare side and sort of the beauty and wellness side? I imagine you can innovate more and faster and with a little bit less guardrails if it's a beauty product than if it's regulated treatment.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I happen to think that the sort of broad horizontal integration at a company like J&J is an enormous benefit. I think in particular, the things that really energize people like myself and a lot of my colleagues are how do we solve some of the world's biggest, hairiest healthcare problems? And I think the way we do that is by bringing to bear the expertise of consumer and device and pharmaceutical with all the scientific and regulatory and clinical know-how. So yes, like we have some examples of things where we're building on existing franchises in consumer or device. We're adding sensors to devices. We're adding adherence programs to pharmaceuticals. We're adding interesting new delivery models to consumer products. But longer term, I think what we're looking at are what are the biggest unmet healthcare needs in the world, both in developed and emerging markets, and how can we bring all of those capabilities that exist at a place like J&J to bear? And when they don't exist, how can we collaborate with the leading technology players or the startup ecosystem to put our heads together and come up with transformative approaches to doing so?
What's been your biggest banging your head against the wall moment? The thing that you're like, oh man, this is going to be harder than I thought. The moment where you're like, man, I got to go back to tech.
Well, I think as with every job or career change, I definitely had my oh Shiite moment about 3 or 4 months in. Like, what am I doing here? And it had nothing to do with J&J specifically. It was more about, like, this is just a different way of thinking about the world. I think that for the most part, the good news is that folks at a place like J&J, and my sense is this is pretty similar across the healthcare landscape, folks want to do the right thing, and they have the right ambitions, and they're thinking about things the right way. It's just how do we actually operationalize it? How do we turn it into, take an idea and turn it into something real? To me, I don't know that I'm necessarily banging my head against the wall, but I would say that that has been the biggest challenge. I think the hallmark of a lot of the companies that I've been lucky enough to be a part of is that they move really quickly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they break things along the way. There are companies that do that, but I think the pace at which things move and that the world is changing necessitates that one just needs to operate at a faster rate. And a company like ours has been in a place for a long time where it hasn't necessarily had to do that because of the markets and the nature of the solutions that it offers. But I think we aspire, like a lot of other companies in healthcare, to just try to accelerate and move faster. And I think that's a constant challenge internally.
How are regulators doing with this? I know in a lot of areas of tech, I've been critical of saying, they're looking to solve yesterday's problems. I'm less steeped in the health regulation field, but I know the FDA has been sort of grappling with how do we make sure that we're protecting Americans' health? How do we make sure that we have rigid processes while at the same time keeping the door open for innovation? How are they keeping up? How have you seen their approach to consumer technology evolve in your time?
So I'll refrain from broader commentary on the administration, but with respect to the FDA, I think we have been very pleased with what we have seen. We've been fortunate enough to be invited into the pilot program that they kicked off a year or so ago with a number of other leading technology companies to reinvent the process of bringing regulated solutions to market. And I've been impressed at the receptivity of the individual regulators at the FDA to different approaches to thinking about how a product comes to market. I think the other thing that's impressive is I think they were the first to admit we don't necessarily know exactly where this is going to end up. And so this is not going to be a situation where we're going to study this for 18 months and then we're going to issue a set of rules and that will be locked down. It's more like it's going to be a V1 and then we'll do point releases and then we'll do full releases, which again is like shipping a piece of software. And I've appreciated that.
Which is also not the way I'm sure they've operated in the past. Flipping the other, because I've given the health side of the world a tough time, how have you seen the tech companies evolve their strategy? I mean, my sense in the early days was that most tech companies were just trying to steer away from real healthcare, and they were, the ones that did venture into it said, whoa, this is tougher than we thought, maybe we'll track steps, maybe we'll do other things so that we don't have to deal with it. What are you seeing? It strikes me that a few of the bigger companies are saying, no, we want to make big things. Apple especially, I think, said, we want to steer into the healthcare field. We want to build those relationships with doctors, hospitals, regulators. How has the tech industry evolved?
Yeah, so I think that my personal perspective, again, having operated in that world for many years, is there's a certain amount of confidence that they have that they can solve any problem in a certain way. So while I think maybe part of it was an intentional, like we're not going to mire ourselves in the regulatory stuff, I think there was a genuine sense that we don't need to because there's another more innovative way to do it. And I think many of those companies have been chastened either through not being able to actually have the impacts that they wanted, or by having the regulators step in and say, hit the brakes, you can't do this. With that said, I have been impressed with the reaction of the technology community to do some of the things that we were discussing earlier. They've been attracting people from healthcare, sort of leading edge thinkers from the healthcare space, and giving them the freedom to come in and think about how to do things differently that are more compliant with regulations, or to reshape how those regulations should look longer term.
When you look out a few years, which tech companies do you expect to be in the marketplace, either with you as partners or as rivals? It seems like Apple, Google, and Amazon are all hiring people from the field. Are all those three names you expect to be there? Who else?
I do. I think they will all be there. What's interesting to me, and is still TBD, is to what level of commitment do these organizations really have to healthcare? I like what I've seen so far from the aforementioned folks. I will also say that there's really interesting things going on in other parts of the world. I and my team have been spending a bunch of time in China, and the leading technology companies there are already doing some things that are even well ahead of anything that's been going on in the US from a technology standpoint. But I think, again, there the question is, how committed are they long-term to this space? The regulations there in a place like China are a little less predictable than they are in the US. So as they shift around, will they pull back? I don't know. But in a sort of perverse way, people like me and my team are sort of drawn to that sort of uncertainty. And we look at it as an opportunity, a company like ours, either on its own or in collaboration with some of these technology companies, to help shape what the future is going to look like.
I was struck yesterday, Tim Cook was interviewed by CNBC on a range of topics, but one of the things he said was that he thought when people look back at Apple many years from now and ask where did it have its biggest impact, he said, I think it's going to be in healthcare. What opportunities do you think there are for the way that we get healthcare, for the way that we think about healthcare, to really shift in the next 5 or 10 years, and maybe to make it a little more concrete? What do you think we do today as a routine part of our healthcare that we won't do or will do dramatically differently 5 or 10 years from now?
Oh, that's a good question. So I didn't actually hear that most recent comment from Tim, but it's consistent with another comment that he's made within the last 6 to 9 months, where he was speaking about what he thinks gives a company like Apple an advantage, which is that they don't feel beholden to the existing reimbursement models, the existing operating models. And to me, I think that's where the opportunity is to bring more of an end user, whether the end user is a well individual, a sick patient, a care provider, a payer, et cetera, and really, just as a classic technology company would, work backwards from what is the set of user needs and how can we build a compelling solution. And the business model will follow from that, which I know sounds like a little sort of technology voodoo, but that to me has been what has created the world's most valuable companies now in the technology space. So I think as the healthcare space shifts into how do we start from what's the real unmet need of a population of users, and then how do we work backwards to build a compelling solution, and we'll figure out what the monetization or commercial model looks like from there. But that's going to require, I think, a larger, well-funded entity or combination of entities in order to float that period of exploration.
So I'm going to hold your feet to the fire a little. We didn't quite get to the question of what do you think 5 or 10 years from now will look remarkably different in terms of how we do healthcare today and how we will do it then?
I suppose that we definitely believe that there will be a much more significant consumer component. We think that there will be a lot of self-care that takes place. I think that I was trying to avoid using the term AI or ML in this 20-minute conversation.
Well, you made it 17 minutes. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a new personal best. But I think that's going to be a big part of the triage and diagnostic component, and we're looking at, again, on our own and in combination with other players, how we can bring that to bear, particularly, again, in markets outside the US.
Where the doctor-patient model just doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And you mentioned AI and ML, and one of the things that needs is data. And one of the things that I think is going to really change is, historically, we've only gotten a really small subset of health data. You get your blood pressure checked when you go to the doctor. And if you get nervous at the doctor, you never get a good read. And you take your temperature when you're sick. To me, I see a great opportunity to track how these things go over time. And this seems something well-positioned to what J&J does. How much are you thinking about how diagnostic data we use today could be more useful and interesting if we collected it more often?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I will say we are thinking about it a lot. The caveat is, and there's been a decent amount of press around this recently, that because we don't yet know exactly which data is going to be the most useful, there's a lot of false positives, there's a lot of sort of the worried well.
This is the Apple Watch, everyone running to the doctor because the ECG.
I mean, my personal perspective on this, and I'm not necessarily speaking on behalf of J&J, is that I still think, and maybe this is just the technologist in me, I still think that it's better than the status quo, meaning it's going to get better over time. We just need to give it enough breathing room and enough oxygen and apply enough brain power, and we'll figure it out. And I don't know whether that is going to take 12 months or 24 or 5 years, but I think we're better off having more data and being able to identify the correlations, the causations, and then we'll get to some magical place. But I think if we cut things off prematurely in the guise of, it's going to create too much chaos, I think that's going to be short-sighted.
Flip side of the question, you've had enough time now to get a sense of where the really sticky and thorny areas are. What's something that we do today that's kind of archaic and frustrating that you think we'll still be doing 5 or 10 years from now just because it's really a tough problem and hard to change?
In healthcare generally?
In healthcare, yeah.
Well, I think the way that the doctor-patient relationship still is fairly medieval, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way to the medical practice. We at J&J are thinking actively about how we can make doctors more effective and have them focus on the most needy patients. And I think we're mindful of the concerns that have been raised around, and there's a fair amount of tools that purport to make doctors' lives easier than the process have made them horrifically worse. And so we're trying to learn from that. But I think that's where there's still a lot of opportunity to create just a better experience for both the doctors and the patients.
You mentioned medieval leeches, I take it not making a comeback?
Bloodletting, yeah, humors, all that good stuff.
Well, I'd love to keep talking, but I really appreciate your experiences, both someone who's worked in tech and in healthcare. If you enjoy this conversation, I do a daily technology newsletter for Axios. You can go to getlogin.axios.com, and we also have a healthcare newsletter, Vitals.
It's a great read.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Ina.